Kia ora tātou. Yes, I'm Louis and I'm at the University of Waikato, and I'm going to be talking about soil carbon. And I put this diagram up there to remind myself and perhaps you that carbon cycling is happening at quite small scales and at quite large scales at the same time, going up to national scales. And there's been quite a lot of excitement around soil carbon over the last few years, and a lot of that has really been brought forward even more with the 4 per mil initiative, which came out of the Paris Accord, where it was proposed that if we could increase the soil carbon content of the world's soils by 0.4%, 4 parts per thousand, we could offset a lot of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And so I thought I would just run the numbers for New Zealand, and if we could actually manage to achieve something like that, that's a sequestration of something like 16 million tonnes of CO2 per year, year on year. And by comparison, it's 38 as our annual greenhouse gas emissions. So that would be a very large number if you could do that. But even the people who put forward the 4 per mil initiative saw that as rather ambitious. And for New Zealand, even more incredibly ambitious because we have such high carbon stocks already. But I do always want to make this last point here that I've got there, is that soil carbon is also really important for soil health, and we shouldn't lose sight of that fact from time to time. So what I want to try and do in this talk is cover these points. How much carbon do we have in New Zealand? Can we store a bit more? Can we measure that change through time? What are the options for gains? And just some examples of what we've been thinking about. Avoiding losses, and then avoiding trade-offs and finding co-benefits. There's not much point in coming up with something that decreases nitrous oxide emissions if suddenly you lose soil carbon. So how do we start thinking about that? And then just look very briefly at some of the options that we've looked at through time. So to start with, the graph in the middle with New Zealand there, the shading indicates the amount of carbon stocks. And the point here is that it's variable across the landscape and across the country, but almost in a predictable way, and that there are areas where there are higher carbon contents than others. But it does vary quite a lot. The graph on the left-hand side is a histogram of the amounts of carbon that are in these different soils. And you can see roughly 120 tonnes per hectare in New Zealand soils, but there is a very wide range. Mike Beer, Sam McNally and co, they did a study where they looked at the potential for the soils that we do have, the soil orders are along the bottom there, for their capacity to store more carbon. And fundamentally there is the capacity to do that, but how we actually manage to achieve that is somewhat still eluding us to a degree. And if we are going to increase this through time, how could we measure this, given the large variability that we have? And this is some work that has only just been completed with Manaki Whenua Lanke Research, and I've been involved as well through the Ministry for Primary Industries. And it was a sort of a statistical analysis of how many sites would we need to sample across New Zealand for the land uses that are listed there to be able to detect a change of about 2 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year, between samplings, I should say. And we came up with about 400 sites sampled correctly and appropriately distributed across the landscape will allow us between sampling times to be able to find a difference of about 2 tonnes. And if you remember the 4 per mil initiative, that would be, if you increase 4 per mil per year, that would be about a 5-year return that you'd be able to pick up something like that. So we can detect relatively small changes if we have the right sampling strategy in place. Just touch on a few options that have been looked at then. This is the first one here, is from Mike Beer's group. And this is called full inversion tillage. And the idea here is you take the top 30 centimetres of soil and you turn it over. And you bury the carbon that was at the surface further down in the profile. And what you're looking for is that doesn't decay as fast as it would have in the past. And at the same time, you expose new soils that doesn't have as much carbon associated with it at the surface where the roots are, and you look to accumulate carbon there. So you're essentially deepening that topsoil. And preliminary estimates of around about 0.3 to 0.5 of a tonne per hectare per year for a 30-year time period, I think it was, Mike. You can correct me if I'm wrong there. Some work that we did at the University of Waikato at a farm that was nearly importing as much feed as it was growing on site. That's a heck of a lot of carbon that you're importing into the system per hectare, about 5 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. And when we did that, we estimated that they were accumulating in their soils about 0.7 of a tonne of carbon per hectare per year for that time period, and modelling was pretty close to that as well. But you've got to remember that that feed was grown somewhere else, and that might have resulted in a carbon loss from that place, that location. So we need to do a full life cycle assessment, not only on the carbon, to see whether this is a viable or not option. And something I just wanted to bring in from the States, this is on some of their soils where it's been long-term degraded soil that have been then put back into grasslands. And this is work that David Tillman's been leading for many years now, where he shows that as you increase the number of species in the mix of the grasslands, you accelerate the recovery rate of carbon in soil. And this is something that we obviously think about when we start thinking about maybe plantain in with our swords as well. Can we get extra gains by bringing in new players into the sword and get the increased diversity and root and carbon inputs into the soil? One of the other things we need to think about with respect to soil carbon is it's very easy to lose. And this is some work that we've been doing looking at pasture renewals, but this applies to any time that the soil is going, or the land is going through one sort of sward transition to another, where it remains bare for a while. And along the bottom here is days since spraying to when you get re-emergence of the new sward. And we've got a couple of examples, these are real examples, where we had a direct drill approach and then we had a fuller cultivation, which took a longer time period. And what happens is that all that time that soil is bare, it's like having a bank account where you're not getting paid anymore. There's no more photosynthesis. So your carbon inputs have stopped. And the microbes in the soil, they don't care, they just keep going. And so you end up losing carbon out of the system. And the longer you leave that system bare, the more carbon that you lose. And it also depends on whether it's wet or dry. Wetter soil's losing more than others. So keeping that renewal time period, that bare time period as short as possible is critical. Now I've wildly extrapolated this to try and get a bit of an understanding of what this might mean then, and so this is the same data, but if you go from about here down to about there, this is roughly equivalent to 3% of New Zealand's agricultural greenhouse gas emissions if you extrapolate it over all of New Zealand. And we shouldn't do that, but I'm trying to show that this is not a trivial issue, I guess, and it applies to a wide range of ways that we manage our system. So if we can do that, and there are reasons we can do that, there are gains to be made. Avoiding trade-offs. Like I said at the beginning, if we produce something that decreases nitrous oxide emissions, then we don't want to lose soil carbon. And we now have the capacity to be able to measure these different gases all at the same time. This is work that we're doing over pastures in the Waikato, where we're measuring continuously paddock scale carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emissions. And this is the pattern that we get with time along the bottom here. And you can see CO2, nitrous oxide and methane is calculated from dry matter intake. And so what we need to do is think about any intervention, about when it's going to occur and what trade-offs that intervention might have on the other greenhouse gases, because in the end it's the net effect that matters. Now this doesn't include the carbon that gets exported in milk that eventually goes back to the atmosphere as well. So I know you can't read this, but this is something that was put up in Science a couple of years ago by Keith Postian, where they came up with essentially a decision tree for how to decrease greenhouse gas emissions from croplands. And we effectively need to do the same for pastoral systems in New Zealand, and we're not quite there yet. But we want to avoid going back up in this direction here and promote going back and coming down in that direction. And that's something that we're going to have to work on across the greenhouse gases. So what have we thought about? These are some of the management options, and I showed this, I think, the last time I spoke here, and we filled in a few more of these as well. These are things where we've got reasonable confidence that you end up with losses or gains, the different management practices that we've been able to explore so far. But what I want to add, and there's a few more in there now, but one of the things that I want to add now is that we want to shift from the left to the right. So even if we know there's a loss, how can we mitigate and reduce the size of those losses? And for example, one of the ones that we could think about a little bit is if we're going through a pasture renewal type process, if we keep it a short time period, that would be great, we reduce those losses. But perhaps there's some way that we can bring in inversion tillage, Mike's ideas and Mike Headley as well, to even shorten that further and end up with an overall gain when you're going through a pasture renewal. So that's something we need to think about. We also need to look at the trade-offs between maize and feed imports to make sure that that's not an overall net loss. So I'll just finish with a couple of quotes that have been around the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. One of the quotes that caught my attention there was, "The amount of carbon is highly variable, and while soil carbon can be gradually increased through careful management, it can also be rapidly lost by inadvertent actions." And this feels like a savings account of a teenager. They save slowly, but they spend fast. And it's my daughter's birthday today. She's just past teenagehood, not quite. So to get at that, we are trying to find ways of reducing or management practices that will increase carbon stocks and avoid losses. And we're now getting really close to being able to measure these changes at national scale. So I think in the longer term we can address that comment. And then lastly, I just came across this one the other day from Bill Gates. "I wish agricultural innovation got as much attention as the impact on climate change from electricity, because its success is just as critical to stopping climate change." So I'll finish there with some acknowledgements. Thank you.